In the summer of 1941, German soldiers kept finding the same strange thing along the roads into the Soviet Union. A tank. The best tank in the world, sitting in a ditch with its hatches thrown open and not one hole punched through it. The crew had climbed out and walked away. Whatever stopped that machine, it was never a German shell. The early T-34 was the finest tank fielded by any army on the planet. And in its first summer of war, it got its own crews stranded and outfought before the design was ready to carry them. The same machine that failed on those roadsides became the tank that rolled into Berlin 4 years later. This is the story of the flaws in between and of the men who paid for them. In June of 1941, a T-34 crested a rise in front of German troops who had never seen one. Their anti-tank crews did what had worked in Poland and in France. They fired. The shells struck the sloped front plate and skated off into the air. Round after round, and the tank kept coming. The standard German anti-tank gun of that summer could not punch through a T-34 at any sane range. It came down to the shape of the steel. The armour was set at a steep angle. A shell that hit it had to bore through far more metal than the plate was actually thick. On top of that armour sat a 76mm gun that could knock out almost anything the Germans owned. The tank rode on wide tracks that floated over mud and snow. The same mud swallowed German panzers whole. To stop a single one, German crews often had to drag up their 88mm anti-aircraft guns and fire them flat over open sights. Or they called down artillery and prayed. A general wrote home that his men had met a tank they could not handle. On paper, it was a catastrophe for the invaders. The Red Army had just under 1,000 T-34s ready on the 22nd of June. Behind them stood more than 500 of the heavier KV tanks. And then, across that same summer, almost all of them were gone. They did not vanish because the Germans found a magic gun. They vanished because of a betrayal built into the tank itself. The T-34 of 1941 had been rushed into the field carrying flaws that had nothing to do with its armour or its gun. Those flaws lived with the two men sitting in the turret. And they lived in the machinery underneath. The costliest flaw of all sat in the turret, which on the early T-34 held just two men. One of them loaded the gun. The other man did everything else. He was the commander. He was also the gunner. He put his eye to the sight and aimed the 76mm cannon. He fired it. And at that same desperate instant, he was supposed to be reading the whole battlefield. He had to pick the next target. His driver needed telling where to steer. If he was a platoon leader, he had to command the other tanks too, all at once. One man cannot do those jobs together. When he bent to the gun sight, he went blind to the battle around him. When he lifted his head to read the battle, he stopped fighting his gun. Every second he worked his own cannon was a second stolen from watching for everyone else. He was trapped inside his own tank. American engineers who stripped an early T-34 down in 1942 wrote the problem out plainly. Quote, "The main weakness of the two-man turret of the T-34 of 1941 is that it is very tight." End quote. 2 grown men, the gun, the shells, the recoil guard, and no floor beneath them that turned with the turret. When the turret swung, the crew shuffled their boots around loose ammunition stacked on the hull deck. The Germans watched what that did in a fight. They left a description of it. Quote, "T-34s operated in a disorganized fashion with little coordination, or else tended to clump together like a hen with its chicks." End quote. The commanders could not see and they could not think because they were buried in the labour of firing the gun. A machine that should have hunted in a clean line instead bunched up and stumbled. One overworked, half-blind man at a time. The blindness got worse the moment the hatches came down. The vision devices on the early tank were poor. The periscopes were narrow and few. The glass inside them was bad. Those same American engineers actually praised the design of the Soviet gun sight. They called it, quote, "the best in the world," end quote. Better than anything their own designers had drawn. Then they added that the quality of the glass in it left much to be desired. A brilliant sight, ruined by cloudy glass poured into it in a hurry. There was nothing on top for the commander to see through either. The early T-34 had no cupola. There was no raised ring of vision blocks on the hatch, no way to look all the way around while staying under armour. To see clearly, he had to crack his hatch and lift his head into the open. That is where the machine gun fire was waiting. So he fought buttoned up and half blind, or he fought exposed and afraid. Both choices got men hurt. It was a cruel little trap, and there was no good way out of it. The fear of it rode with every crew. Then there was the silence. Most of the early T-34s carried no radio at all. A radio was expensive and in short supply, and there was barely room for one in that cramped hull. So it went only to the platoon leader's tank, roughly 1 machine in 5. The other 4 were deaf and mute. To command them, the Soviets fell back on flags. The leader was supposed to lean out of his hatch and wave coloured flags at the tanks around him. They were supposed to read the flags and obey. A real battle drowned all of it. Yamda, smoke, dust thrown up by the tracks, muzzle blast and deafening noise. And a man is meant to talk by waving a flag at another crew who is also blind, also buttoned up, and cannot spare the eyes to look for him. It did not work. A platoon of 5 T-34s that should have engaged 5 separate targets instead crowded onto whichever one the leader was shooting at. His was the only tank anyone could follow. All that firepower thrown away because 4 tanks out of 5 could not be told what to do. It left the crews helpless, fighting alone inside a crowd. The one radio they did have carried its own curse. The early radio tanks wore a distinctive handrail antenna along the hull, a metal rail that no other tank had. German gunners learned to read it. That rail marked the command tank, the one machine that could actually coordinate the rest. So it became the first tank the Germans tried to eliminate. Take out the commander with the antenna, and the 4 blind tanks around him fell apart. What stranded them needed no German shot at all. The early T-34 was mechanically unreliable in a way that is hard to believe of so famous a machine. Worst of all was the transmission. When the Americans ran their captured T-34 on the test track, the teeth on the gears crumbled to pieces under load. They checked the metal. The heat treatment on the gears was so poor it failed their standards outright. Just as fragile was the turret's electric traverse motor. It was underpowered. It sparked and overloaded when the crew swung the turret. Burned itself out, which is a deadly thing to happen when a target is crossing in front of you and the gun will not follow. The clutch was crude and brutal. It was so heavy and unforgiving that shifting gear on the move took real muscle and long practice. A tired driver in a bad moment could wreck the whole drivetrain with one hard pull. The crews knew it. Early T-34s often went into battle with a spare transmission lashed to the back deck by steel cable. They hauled a replacement gearbox into the fight with them, bolted to the outside of the armour like a spare wheel. They did it because they expected the one inside to fail. The engine carried its own hidden flaw. The V2 was a genuinely advanced diesel, one of the first mass-produced diesel engines ever put in a tank. Diesel was harder to set on fire than the gasoline the Germans used. But its air filter, a type called the Poman, was close to useless. It could not clean the air the engine breathed. Some of them were welded so badly they could not even hold their own bath of oil. On the dust of a Russian summer road, grit poured straight into the cylinders and ground them to scrap. When the Americans ran their T-34, it drove about 213 miles and then died on the spot. Pistons and cylinders were wrecked. A summer's worth of dirt had gone into the engine because the filter let it. Early in the war, that engine often wore out far short of its intended life, ground down by the same dust that choked its filter. One Soviet wartime report to the head of the Red Army's Tank Directorate put the average distance a T-34 could travel before a major overhaul at only about 125 miles. There was one more weight pressing down on all of it. And this one was not the tank's fault, or the crew's. There was no time to train anyone. Tanks came off the line and went straight to units that had never seen them. Crews received their T-34s days before battle, with almost no hours behind the controls. A driver who had never learned the trick of that vicious clutch was handed a machine that punished every mistake. Then he was driven straight at the enemy. The flaws in the steel and the flaws in the schedule fed each other. Put all of that next to the roads of 1941 and you get the abandoned tanks. A T-34 whose clutch failed was dead weight. So was one whose engine choked on dust, or one that simply ran dry of fuel. The Red Army's tank units had almost no recovery vehicles. And they had no time to wait for them, because the front was falling back faster than a broken tank could be dragged home. So a crew whose armour no German gun could crack would climb out of a machine that was still fully protected and still fully armed. They left it in the ditch. A single stripped gear, and there was no way to tow it out. The numbers are staggering. By the end of December 1941, the Soviets had lost around 2,334s. That was nearly the entire fleet they had started the war with, plus thousands more built during the year. Gone in 6 months. And by the best accounts, close to half of every tank the Red Army lost that year broke down, bulked down, or ran out of fuel. The enemy never touched them. Half of the finest armour in the world, defeated by its own gearbox and its own air filter before a German gunner ever drew a bead. 4 young crewmen sitting inside armour that had already shrugged off shells that would have gutted a German tank. And they're climbing out and walking east on foot because the machine under them has quit. They did nothing wrong. They fought as bravely as any soldiers on that whole front. There is a real grief in it. The tank betrayed them. They were handed a weapon sent to war half finished and told to win with it anyway. There is a name behind that tank. And there is a debt owed to him. Mikhail Koshkin was the engineer who fought his own bosses to build the T-34 the way he believed it had to be built. To prove it, in the spring of 1940, he drove 2 prototypes cross-country through freezing mud, all the way to Moscow and back, so the leadership could see with their own eyes what the tank could do. On that punishing drive, he caught a chill. It turned to pneumonia. In September of 1940, months before the war began, he died of it. He never saw a T-34 fire a shot in anger, nor the roadsides full of his tanks abandoned and rusting. And he never saw what the men who came after him made of his design. Because the flaws were real, and every last one of them got fixed. The engineers who inherited Koshkin's work, led by Alexander Morozov, spent the war hammering the weaknesses out of the tank one at a time. The murderous clutch and the crumbling gearbox gave way to a proper 5-speed transmission a driver could actually use. The hopeless pom-on air filter was thrown out. At the end of 1942, it was replaced by a cyclone filter that finally scrubbed the air, so the engines stopped grinding themselves apart. The diesel was refined until it held together in real service, and radios stopped being a luxury for the platoon leader. They started going into every tank, so a company could finally talk to itself instead of waving flags into the smoke. In the spring of 1944 came the change that answered the worst flaw of all. The new model was the T-34-85. It carried a bigger gun in a far bigger turret. And that turret held 3 men instead of 2. The new crewman was a gunner to aim and fire. There was a separate loader to feed the gun. And that meant the commander was finally free to do nothing but command. He got a raised cupola on his hatch, ringed with vision slits and a periscope that let him see a full circle around his tank without ever lifting his head into the open. The blind, overworked, silent commander of 1941 was gone. In his place sat a man who could watch the whole battlefield and talk to his platoon by radio, firing through a gunner whose only job was to shoot. That is the tank people remember. Ground the German army back across 1,000 miles and swarmed the approaches to Berlin in 1945. It became the most produced tank of the entire war. The legend of the T-34 is real. It is just built on top of a first year that was closer to a disaster. And it was paid for by the crews who carried a half-finished machine into battle and got nothing back but a long walk home. So go back to that tank in the ditch in the summer of 1941. Hatches open. Armour unmarked. Quietly rusting while the war rolled east past it. A better enemy did not put it there. The rush that built it did. But the men who inherited that failure learned every lesson the abandoned tank had to teach. And they turned the machine that failed its first cruise into the one that outlived the men who invaded them. The T-34 did win the war. It just had to survive its own making first.